In a war-torn village, a spoiled young woman's life crumbles in an instant. Trapped and alone, her only hope appears in the form of a stray dog and unlikely savior with a mysterious past. What unfolds between them is a battle for survival where every moment counts and one decision could mean life or death. What secret does this dog hold, and will it be enough to save them both?
Isabel had always known comfort and luxury, living in the heart of a picturesque European village untouched by the war. Her days were filled with trivial pursuits, shopping in high-end boutiques, attending elegant, and indulging in the finest foods. The war was a distant murmur, something she read about in the papers but never truly understood. To Isabel, the world revolved around her, and anything beyond her immediate desires felt inconsequential. Her father, a wealthy businessman, had always provided for her, ensuring she never wanted for anything. This sheltered life left Isabel indifferent to the struggles of others. The village itself was a haven of beauty, with cobblestone streets lined with charming cottages, each with a garden overflowing with flowers. The air was always fresh, filled with the scent of blooming roses and the sound of birds singing. It was a place where children played freely, and neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles. Isabel's home was the grandest of them all, a sprawling estate that seemed to encapsulate all the village's charm and prosperity. Yet, despite this idyllic setting, Isabel found herself bored and restless, yearning for excitement without understanding its cost. Isabel's disdain extended beyond her fellow villagers to the animals that roamed the streets. A particular stray dog often caught her eye, very thin and clearly homeless. The sight of the creature disgusted her. "Why doesn't someone take it away?" she would mutter to herself as she passed by, her nose wrinkling in disdain. To Isabel, the dog was nothing more than a nuisance, a reminder of the unpleasant realities she preferred to ignore. She would often chase it away, hurling stones to keep it from sullying her perfect world. Compassion was a foreign concept to her. As the war crept closer, Isabel remained oblivious to the subtle changes in her village. Fewer men were seen in the streets as they were called to the front lines, and supplies grew scarcer. Yet, Isabel's life continued much the same, insulated by her father's wealth. She didn't notice the worry etched on her neighbors' faces, or the way the village grew quieter with each passing day. The war was still a distant concern, something that happened elsewhere. Little did Isabel know, her sheltered existence was about to be shattered in ways she could never have imagined. The morning of the bombing began like any other, calm and serene, with the sun casting a warm glow over the village. Isabel, oblivious to the world's turmoil, lounged in her opulent living room, sipping tea from a fine china cup. The distant hum of aircraft engines barely registered in her mind, more an annoyance than a cause for concern. She was too engrossed in her thoughts, planning her next shopping trip. Suddenly, the world outside her window erupted in chaos. The first bomb struck with a deafening roar, shaking the very foundations of her home. Panic gripped Isabel as she realized the village was under attack. The once peaceful streets were now filled with screams and the sounds of explosions. The ground beneath her feet trembled as more bombs fell, each one closer than the last. The grand estate that had been her sanctuary was now a prison, with debris falling around her as the walls cracked and the ceiling threatened to collapse. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled through the house, her once pristine life reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. She was no longer safe. In a desperate attempt to escape, Isabel made her way to the front door, only to be thrown to the ground by another explosion. The force of the blast sent her crashing into a wall, pain shooting through her body as she crumpled to the floor. Blood trickled down her forehead, and she struggled to remain conscious. The house was falling apart around her, each piece of debris a stark reminder of the life she had taken for granted. As the dust settled, Isabel found herself trapped under a heavy beam, unable to move, her world reduced to a crumbling ruin. The once vibrant village was now a war zone, with smoke and dust filling the air. Isabel could barely see through the haze, her vision blurred by pain and fear. The sounds of war were all around, her screams, explosions, and the relentless roar of engines overhead. She tried to call out for help, but her voice was weak, drowned out by the chaos. In that moment, Isabel realized how truly alone she was. The village she had known and the life she had led were gone, consumed by the war she had ignored for so long. Isabel lay trapped beneath the heavy beam, her once beautiful dress torn and bloodied. The weight of the debris pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she knew she had to escape. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she struggled to free herself, her fingers scraping against the rough wood. She could feel her strength waning, the eddies of her vision darkening as the reality of her situation set in. She was no longer the untouchable Isabel. She was just another victim of the war. As she lay there, gasping for breath, Isabel's thoughts drifted to the life she had lost. The grand estate, the luxurious parties, the carefree days, they all seemed so distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized how foolish she had been to take it all for granted. She had been so wrapped up in her own world that she hadn't seen the suffering around her, hadn't cared about the lives torn apart by the war. Now, she was paying the price for her indifference, trapped and helpless in the wreckage of her former life. Just as despair began to take hold, Isabel heard a faint sound, something beyond the chaos and destruction. She strained to listen, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a soft whimper, almost drowned out by the distant explosions. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of her mind in its desperate state. But then she heard it again, closer this time. With great effort, Isabel turned her head towards the sound, her eyes searching through the dust and debris. There, just a few feet away, was the stray dog she had always despised. The dog, dirty and ragged, stood hesitantly near her, its eyes wide with fear. It seemed just as lost and frightened as Isabel, yet it had found its way to her in her moment of need. Isabel's heart softened for the first time as she looked at the creature. It didn't matter that it was dirty or unwanted. It was alive, and it had come to her. She reached out a trembling hand towards the dog, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me," she pleaded, not knowing if the dog could understand, but hoping beyond hope that it could. The dog hesitated for a moment, its eyes darting between Isabel and the debris around them. Despite its fear, it slowly approached her, sniffing the air cautiously. Isabel's hand trembled as the dog drew closer, its wet nose brushing against her fingers. The touch was gentle, almost comforting in the midst of the chaos surrounding them. For a brief moment, Isabel forgot her pain and fear, focusing solely on the dog. She could see the exhaustion in its eyes, the weariness of a creature that had survived on its own for so long, yet still found the strength to help. Isabel's heart swelled with gratitude as the dog began to nudge at the beam pinning her down. It wasn't much, but the small effort gave her a glimmer of hope. With the dog's help, she managed to shift the beam just enough to free herself. Pain shot through her body as she crawled out from under the debris, her movements slow and labored. The dog stayed by her side, watching her intently as if understanding her struggle. Isabel knew she owed her life to this stray, this creature she had once dismissed as worthless. Together, they made their way through the ruins of the house. The dog led the way, carefully picking a path through the rubble. Isabel followed, her legs shaky and weak, but she forced herself to keep moving. The dog paused occasionally, looking back to ensure she was still with it. Each time, Isabel felt a surge of determination, driven by the dog's silent encouragement. The bond between them grew stronger with every step, forged in the fires of their shared ordeal. Isabel no longer saw the dog as a nuisance, but as a companion, perhaps the only one she had left. As they emerged from the ruins, Isabel looked around at the devastation that had once been her village. Smoke billowed from the remains of buildings, and the streets were littered with debris. The sounds of war had faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Isabel's heart ached as she took in the sight, realizing that everything she had known was gone. But the dog was still with her, its presence a small but powerful reminder that not all was lost. Isabel took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead, knowing she would face it with her new companion by her side. As Isabel and the dog ventured deeper into the village, they passed the ruins of familiar places, homes, shops, and the market square that had once been bustling with life. Each sight brought a pang of sorrow, but Isabel pressed on, her thoughts focused on survival. The dog seemed to sense her resolve, staying close as they moved through the rubble. Suddenly, the dog stopped, sniffing the air with renewed interest. Isabel watched as it began to dig at a pile of debris, its actions deliberate and focused. Curious, she knelt beside the dog, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands. Beneath the debris, they uncovered a wooden trapdoor, partially hidden by fallen beams. Isabel's heart skipped a beat as she realized what the dog had found a cellar, possibly untouched by the destruction above. With a surge of energy, she pulled the door open, revealing a dark space below. The air inside was musty but cool, and as Isabel peered into the darkness, she could make out shelves lined with supplies. Relief washed over her, and she quickly descended into the cellar, the dog following closely behind. For the first time since the bombing, Isabel felt a sense of safety. Inside the cellar, Isabel found more than just a place to hide. There were canned goods, bottled water, and even a few blankets neatly stacked on a shelf. It was clear that someone had prepared this space as a refuge. Perhaps the elderly villager who once lived here. Isabel's thoughts briefly turned to the person who had left these supplies behind, wondering if they had survived the bombing, or if they had fled before the attack. As she settled down on the cold floor, the dog curled up beside her, its body warm against her side, providing both comfort and companionship. In the dim light of the cellar, Isabel began to reflect on the events that had brought her to this point. The opulent life she had once led felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the stark reality of war. The dog's unexpected loyalty had awakened something within her sense of responsibility she had never felt before. She realized that surviving this ordeal would require more than just physical strength. It would demand a change in her heart. As she rested in the safety of the cellar, Isabel vowed to protect the dog, just as it had protected her. They were no longer alone in this war-torn world. They had each other. The safety of the cellar was temporary, and Isabel knew they couldn't stay there forever. Supplies were limited, and the risk of discovery was high. The sounds of war had quieted for now, but the threat remained ever present. Isabel decided it was time to leave the village, to find a place where they could truly be safe. She packed what little they had into a small bag, securing it over her shoulder. The dog watched her, its eyes filled with understanding. When she was ready, they climbed out of the cellar together, stepping back into the harsh light of day. The village was unrecognizable, its former beauty buried under the weight of destruction. Isabel's heart ached as she walked through the empty streets, the dog trotting close by her side. They moved cautiously, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted. The journey was slow and treacherous, with rubble and fallen trees blocking their path at every turn. Isabel's injuries still pained her, but she pushed through the discomfort, driven by the need to survive. The dog was her guide, leading her through the maze of ruins with an uncanny sense of direction, its loyalty unwavering. As they approached the outskirts of the village, Isabel noticed a group of soldiers patrolling a nearby road. Panic surged within her. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. She quickly ducked behind a wall, pulling the dog close to keep it quiet. Her heart pounded in her chest as the soldiers passed by, their boots crunching on the gravel. The dog remained still, its body pressed against hers, as if understanding the danger. Isabel held her breath until the soldiers were out of sight, then exhaled shakily, relieved that they had escaped detection. The encounter left her shaken, but more determined than ever. With the soldiers gone, Isabel and the dog continued their journey, finally reaching the edge of the village as the sun began to set. The landscape beyond was desolate, the fields that once bloomed with crops now barren and scarred by war. Isabel knew that their journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She had survived the bombing, escaped the ruins, and avoided capture with the help of the dog she had once despised. As they walked into the fading light, Isabel glanced down at her companion, grateful for the bond that had formed between them. Together, they would face whatever came next. As Isabel and the dog ventured further from the village, the landscape grew more desolate. The war had left its mark on everything. Fields were barren, trees were scorched, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. Isabel's injuries were taking their toll, but she pushed forward, relying on the dog for strength and guidance. The bond between them had grown deep, a silent understanding formed through shared struggle. But as they made their way through a rocky path, the dog suddenly yelped in pain. Isabel turned to see it limping, blood seeping from a wound on its leg. Panic surged through Isabel as she knelt beside the dog, her hands trembling. The sight of the injury brought tears to her eyes. This creature, who had saved her life, was now hurt because of her. She knew they couldn't continue without addressing the wound. Isabel searched a small bag, finding only a torn piece of cloth. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With gentle hands, she wrapped the cloth around the dog's leg, trying to stop the bleeding. The dog whined softly, but remained still, trusting Isabel's care. The bond between them deepened in that moment. As night began to fall, Isabel realized they needed to find shelter. The dog's injury meant they couldn't travel far, and the cold was setting in. They stumbled upon a small, abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the field. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were shattered, but it was the best option they had. Isabel helped the dog inside, laying it down on a pile of hay in the corner. She could see the pain in its eyes, and it tore at her heart. Isabel felt helpless. knowing that without proper care, the dog might not survive. In the dim light of the farmhouse, Isabel made a difficult decision. She took off her scarf, one of the last remnants of her former life, and tore it into strips. Using the cloth, she created a makeshift bandage for the dog's wound, securing it tightly. It was a small sacrifice, but it meant everything to her. Isabel stayed by the dog's side all night, whispering words of comfort as it rested. She knew they were both fighting for their lives, and she wasn't going to give up on the dog that had saved her. For the first time, Isabel understood the true meaning of sacrifice. The following morning, Isabel woke to the sound of distant gunfire, a stark reminder that they were still in a war zone. The dog's injury had not worsened, but it was clear they needed help. Isabel gathered what little strength she had left and prepared to leave the farmhouse. The journey ahead would be perilous, but she couldn't stay in one place for long. The dog, despite its injury, stood up and limped beside her, its loyalty unwavering. Together, they set out again, determined to find safety, even though the odds seemed stacked against them. As they walked, the landscape slowly began to change. The barren fields gave way to patches of green, and in the distance, Isabel spotted what looked like a small encampment. Her heart leaped with hope. Perhaps this was the safe haven she had heard about, a place where refugees were gathering. The dog seemed to sense her excitement, picking up the pace despite its injury. As they approached, Isabel could see makeshift tents and the faint glow of fires. People moved about, tending to the wounded and sharing what little they had. It was a sight that filled her with a cautious optimism. When they finally reached the outskirts of the encampment, Isabel was met by a group of wary villagers. They eyed her with suspicion, but softened when they saw the state of the dog. A woman stepped forward, offering Isabel a place to rest and promising to look after the dog's injury. Isabel felt a wave of relief wash over her. Everything they had been through, they had finally found help. As the villagers led her and the dog to a small tent, Isabel couldn't hold back the tears. They were safe, at least for now, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. Inside the tent, Isabel sat down on a crude bed of blankets, exhausted but grateful. The dog lay beside her, its wound being tended to by a kind old woman who had seen too much suffering in her lifetime. Isabel watched in silence, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had made it this far, not because of her own strength, but because of the dog that had saved her life. As she drifted off to sleep, Isabel thought about the journey that had brought her here. The war had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something precious, a true friend. Isabel awoke to the sound of quiet voices and the smell of wood smoke. The dog lay beside her, its wound carefully bandaged, looking up at her with trusting eyes. The pain in its gaze had lessened, and Isabel knew it would recover. She sat up, feeling the weight of exhaustion still pressing down on her. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. The safe haven was a humble place, filled with people who had lost everything, yet still found ways to care for one another. It was a place of healing, both physically and emotionally. During the days that followed, Isabel had time to reflect on everything that had happened. The life she had known before the war seemed like a distant memory, almost as if it had belonged to someone else. The wealth and privilege that had once defined her were now meaningless in the face of the struggles she had endured. The war had stripped away her superficialities, leaving behind a person she barely recognized. Someone who understood the value of compassion and the strength that comes from enduring hardship. Isabel knew she would never be the same, but she was okay with that. As Isabel regained her strength, she began to help out in the encampment. She assisted the elderly woman who had cared for the dog, learning how to dress wounds and comfort those in pain. The dog was never far from her side, its loyalty unwavering. Isabel saw it as a symbol of her transformation. A creature she had once despised now represented everything she had come to value. The villagers accepted her without question, recognizing the change in her demeanor. She was no longer the spoiled, indifferent woman they had once known. She was one of them now, sharing in their struggles and victories. The war still raged on, and the future was uncertain. Was Eva felt ready to face whatever came next. She had found a new purpose in this small community, helping others and caring for the dog that had saved her life. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged in the fires of war and hardship. As she looked out over the encampment, watching the sun rise over the distant hills, Isabel knew she had been given a second chance. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, and a friend who would stay by her side through whatever lay ahead.